am really, really honored to be joined today by my friend Mikhael Manekin, who has written a book that is just about to come out in Hebrew. The book is called Sermons from the Abyss. Written over the past 5 years, it originated as a series of sermons reflecting on the five Megillot read in synagogue throughout the year. These sermons, initially distributed as booklets in synagogues by activists from the faithful left and Children of Abraham, a religious anti-occupation collective, address the conflicts in Gaza and the West Bank through a traditional lens. They delve into themes such as political despair, alienation within Jewish communities, vengeance and violence, and love for Israel as both a place and a people. The book is published by Makom, a new Israeli publishing house dedicated to releasing books, and an upcoming Jewish journal from a faithful left perspective. And before I jump into questions, I just want to say that I think that the Jewish people are going to be, in my view, going to be living in the wreckage of this, what maybe we could call a churban in Gaza, just the utter destruction of a place and a people. I think for not just the rest of our lives, but probably well beyond that. So those consequences are, I think, will envelop Jewish life in every way, including theologically and spiritually. And I think that so there's a desperate need, I think, for people who have the capacity to start beginning to think through what that means. And I think Mikhail is one of the people who is one of the most important people who started to do that really difficult work. And I think it's going to be immensely meaningful to people that there is someone at this moment who's starting to do that work. So I'm really, really grateful to you for writing the book and for chatting.
Um, Thanks. It's very kind of you to say all of those things. But yeah, it's a complicated time. I mean, Peter, we've had this conversation also in the past. I think sort of when speaking with American audiences, a lot of times part of the challenge is sort of stepping out of the abyss that we're in, and trying to have a conversation from the perspective that you guys are in, which is very difficult to do.
Yeah.
We'll try our best.
Well, so maybe just by way of introduction, we should just say for people who are not familiar, just maybe you want to say something about what the five Megillot are, their place in the Hebrew Bible, their place in Jewish worship, just as a little background as we then go through each one of these Megillot in turn that you wrote about.
Um, Sure. If it's okay, just to preface, I mean, also just to sort of put my mindset into where I am, and also to complexify the conversation, which I think is important for me to do, to ground it in my week. So I'm just returning now from a shiva, from a morning of a son of very close friends of ours from our synagogue, Hakel, who was killed this week, beginning of the week in Gaza. So to the extent that we'll be talking about Torah, first of all, I'd be happy that the words will be what we call Leilu Nishmato for his rest or for the ascent of his soul. Um, and yeah, that was. I'm just putting that in there because it's important for me also
Thank you.
to say. Sure. Okay, so basically, Jews, when we congregate, either on Sabbath or on festivals, we read from the Bible, from the Torah, specifically, every time with a portion which fits the certain day that we're supposed to read. There are five times a year where we basically read Megillah, which translates into scroll. And it's basically stories which I think most people will know, but we read I'm doing it in the order of the book. We're on Shavuot, which is one of our main holidays. We read the book of Ruth. In Tisha B'Av, or the 9th of Av, which is a day where we commemorate the destruction of the temple. We read Lamentations or Eicha. In Sukkot, or part of Sukkot, we read at the end of Sukkot, we read I think it's called Ecclesiastics in English.
Ecclesiastes, yeah, yes, Ecclesiastes.
Uh, Ecclesiastes, yeah. So we read that.
Right. Kohelet,
Um,
Hebrew, right.
yeah, it's weird. Kohelet on Purim, famously we read the Book of Esther.
Mhm.
And lastly, on during Passover we read Song of Songs. So it's basically a tradition which has been around for a very long time. Those are read from a separate scroll which we bring in, and usually during those days we also give sermons around those stories. Or those scrolls. These sermons were written over the last couple of years. Basically, the first one was written in Shavuot or during the springtime in November 2023. So that's right after the elections. Um, for us in sort of the religious world in general and religious world in Israel specifically, it's an opportunity to sort of look for um, um, I don't know if messages, but sort of ideas which might resonate with us. And a lot of times, the scrolls are the stories are very difficult. Book of Lamentations difficult, Book of Ruth. There's a lot of issues, a lot of stories of vengeance and Esther and so on. So this happened to be sort of two very, very, very challenging years. And the book is really an attempt to deal with that. I would say in sort of Jewish sermon form, a lot of it is a story and a lot of it is sort of messages and it's intertwined. So when we sort of dive in, I'll try to give a bit of background to the sermons themselves. But yeah, maybe I'll say just also by way of introduction, Faithful Left is I wouldn't even say the word movement at this point. I'd say sort of a stream in the Jewish world in Israel, which is developing of people who come from a faith-based tradition and from a left perspective. Um, Bnei Avraham, or Children of Abraham, is actually an activist collective which has been around for quite a while. We work in Hebron, do solidarity work with Palestinians in the city. Yeah, and that's basically the background for this.
Hmm. Well, great. So let's start where you started, with Shavuot, um, and the Book of Ruth, and tell us what reading that very very famous text in the against the backdrop of these times provoked in you.
Sure. I mean, well, first I'll say it's really weird reading, even reading a year and a half back. This is before the 7th of October, not much before, let's say a half year before the 7th of October, and reading it back, the sense of anxiety that so many of us had here, how palpable that was. We talk about the 7th of October justly as a turning point uh, in the Israeli world, in the Jewish world, in the Palestinian world, of course. But it's not like before the 7th of October, things were pretty cheery. So for me, that was the backdrop. And the Book of Ruth always interests me because it's so much about alienation and the feeling of foreignness. And Ruth, in many senses, is a really interesting character because she is the ultimate foreigner. And she's also sort of the considered the great grandmother of sort of the first king of Israel, David. So that sort of weird position where she's very much an other but still considered a central character.
Because
For me was
She's a Moabite who returns with Naomi back
yeah,
to the land of Israel, but not
not
in
and not even clear that she's becomes Jewish.
right. Yeah,
Meaning
it's a good point.
she's she's a Moabite and she's a foreigner. And in a time of incredible hardship. One of the things that or one of the teachings that we've been dealing a lot with in the faithful left is trying to figure out how to be um, um, comfortable with your otherness in the Jewish context and in the Israeli context, and that very much that tradition of what we call in Hebrew a ger, is
Can you
and
translate
root
as
is
stranger?
ger, a
Is
stranger. Yeah, and in many senses,